The wind carried no scent that day, only the sharp bite of cold and the restless rustle of dry sagebrush against the side of the cabin. Emory Hale sat near a cold hearth, one hand cupped around a chipped tin mug that hadn't held anything warm. In days, the firewood pile was untouched, not out of scarcity, but out of habit. Letting the cold in had become its own kind of penance. The cabin creaked in places it never used to, like it too had aged with him. Walls once filled with laughter, small talk, and the soft crackle of Ruth's knitting needles now sat in still silence. His rocking chair barely moved, though wind touched everything else. Even time, it seemed, had been reluctant to visit lately. Outside dusk began its descent. The land flattened out like an old map, barren, brown, and bruised by the wind. Snow hovered in the sky, uncertain but close. He heard no horses, no wagon, not even the distant thunder of hooves. Only the wind and the faint clatter of loose tin on the roof. Then came the flicker. At first, he thought it was memory, Ruth holding a lantern, calling him in for stew. But when he stood and walked to the window, squinting through the frost-crusted pane, he saw something real. Candles. 10 of them. 10 flames danced in the low light, each held by a woman wrapped in worn shawls and hides. Some were young, faces round with youth, others lined and deep with years. One carried a woven cradleboard strapped to her back. Another had scars etched into her cheeks like stories carved by fire. They stood still, not asking, not shouting, just being. Emory's jaw tightened. His hand found the rifle by the door, instinct more than intention. He'd seen women like this before. Back when uniforms meant orders, and orders meant silence while others bled. He'd watched fires rise behind villages and turned away. And Ruth, when she found out what he'd seen and done nothing to stop, had barely looked at him for weeks. That silence had stung worse than any blade. The women didn't flinch at the barrel pointed through the cracked door. One of them, older, tall, with braids that fell like willow branches, stepped forward. Her eyes were not begging, but neither were they cold. She placed a hand flat on her chest, then to her lips, then outward, as if offering something unseen. Emory stood there, the cold licking at his bare forearms, snow beginning to pepper his boots. He opened his mouth to say something. Nothing came. The tall woman spoke softly. "One night, warm for baby, then go." Her English was halting, but clear. The younger girl behind her coughed, a hollow, brittle sound that cracked into the dark like dry firewood. The others shifted slightly, not fearfully, but protectively. He could have shut the door. Should have. It wasn't his war anymore. It wasn't his guilt to carry. But something in the girl's cough, or maybe the way the oldest woman stood still, unashamed and unarmed, rattled his bones in a way he hadn't felt in years. Ruth would have opened the door. She'd have brought water, wrapped the girl in the wool quilt she'd made from their wedding flannels. Instead, Emory just stepped back, left the door open. They entered one by one, soundless as snow falling on dry leaves. The fireless hearth stood like a judgment in the room. One woman began to unpack a satchel, sage bundles, flint, small, dried roots. She knelt near the hearth, and without asking, began to build a fire. Another pulled off her moccasins and placed them neatly by the door. They spoke in low voices, not afraid, just respectful of the hush. The baby was asleep. The young girl had laid down with her head on another's lap, still coughing now and then. Emory leaned against the far wall, arms folded tight across his chest. "You're not here tomorrow," he muttered. The tall woman, Luda, she later said her name, was nodded. Only night. The fire caught, crackling its way back into the cabin like a long-lost friend. It cast shadows that danced on the walls, stretched across the rocking chair, kissed the brass lamp that had sat unused for years. Emory looked around the room, the boots lined by the door, the baby bundled in hides by the warmth, the shawls hanging by nails where coats once were. Strangers had filled his silence with breath again. It was not comfort he felt, not warmth, not yet. It was memory rising like steam from the fire. That rocking chair hadn't moved in 3 winters. Now the light touched it again. That was... The moment he understood opening the door hadn't just let in the cold, it had let the past walk in and sit beside it. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the log walls, stretching like old memories trying to find a place to settle. Emory stayed against the far wall, one hand on his rifle, though his grip had loosened. His eyes didn't blink much. He watched every motion not out of distrust, but out of habit, like a man who'd walked too long among ghosts to believe the living meant no harm. The women moved quietly, each step deliberate, each gesture mindful of space. They did not speak loud, did not ask questions, and did not touch what wasn't theirs. A few set small cloth bundles on the floor, bone needles, strips of jerky, small clay jars. From one jar came a sweet, biting scent, pine resin, cracked open and set near the hearth, releasing a perfume that curled upward with the smoke. One of the younger women lit another candle and placed it on the windowsill. Then another followed suit. By the time they were done, a soft perimeter of flickering light circled the room, as if the cabin itself were being blessed or bound in. Silence. A few of them murmured in Comanche, not loud enough for Emory to make out the meaning, but not soft enough to be secrets. Their words moved like songs, old and aching. Looked down at the floorboards near the hearth, and at the ghost that still lingered there. Ruth used to kneel in that very spot, arranging herbs on a drying cloth, humming under her breath while the soup bubbled. She'd always loved the smell of pine, said it reminded her of her mother's winter cabin. She'd hung dried lavender from the rafters, wore hand-stitched skirts, and drank tea in that blue porcelain cup, now sitting, untouched, by the edge of the hearth. Emory hadn't touched that cup since the day she died. Fever took her in a single week right after the war ended. One minute she was brushing the dirt off his collar with a half-smile, and the next she was burning with heat, babbling in half-dreams, calling for someone named Clara he'd never met. Just inches from the fire, its seat, smoothed by Ruth's years of use, had a knitted shawl slung over the back. That, too, had stayed untouched, not out of reverence, but out of something colder. Like Emory believed if he'd let it move, she'd be gone for good. One of the older Comanche women stood before it now. Her hair was streaked with silver, braided, with beads the color of storm clouds. She didn't touch the chair. She only looked. Then she looked at the cup. Her brow creased, not with confusion, but with recognition. Emory saw it in her face. "You knew her," he said flatly. The woman turned, nodded once. Ruth, ... She trade. Herbs, stories, she smiled. He stared at her, something hollow blooming in his chest. Where East River Bend. 3 winters. Before fever came. His mouth went dry. Ruth had always gone out further than he liked, to gather yarrow, to trade. She said fences were only useful for animals. The people should cross them when kindness asked them to. He'd warned her, told her it was dangerous, that one wrong meeting could end in bullets. She hadn't listened. She'd told him she wouldn't live her life inside a man's fear. Now here stood a woman who'd once shared tea with Ruth while he sat cleaning his rifle in the barn. The rifle now hung loosely at his side. Weight felt heavier. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls. Snow whispered down the roof like sand pouring through an hourglass. The storm wasn't angry, just steady, as if the world was urging him to stay still and listen. He sat down. On the wooden bench, not quite relaxing, not quite surrendering. His knees cracked from stiffness. One of the women offered him a cup, not tea, but hot water steeped with something sharp and earthy. He took it without a word. It tasted bitter, but it warmed him. From the corner of his eye, he saw the older woman, the one who'd known Ruth, place a string of dried berries and woven twine on the mantel. A kind of offering, maybe, or memory. He closed his eyes for just a moment. Behind his lids, images rose. The scarred village, smoke rising, a woman screaming in a tongue no one translated. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he hadn't stopped. The ones who did, he'd stood there. Orders were orders. That's what he told Ruth. It's what he told himself, too, till she stopped asking. Now here he was, a rifle, a chair, a cup, and 10 strangers wrapped in silence. The fire popped. Suddenly, and a small ember jumped out. One of the girls stomped it quickly. She didn't look at him, just smiled slightly as if to say, "Don't worry, We've lived through worse. Emory nodded once, without meaning to. He looked again at the chair. Didn't moved, but it didn't feel quite so alone now. Candle beside it burned low, its wax pooling like melted snow. The past, he thought, doesn't knock, just walks in when you least expect it and sits down beside your regrets. The storm came suddenly, as if the land itself had held its breath too long and finally let go. Rain pelted the cabin roof in wild rhythm, hammering against the logs with the sound of old regrets. Wind howled through the cracks in the shutters, making the candle flames dance violently before settling into an uneasy flicker. Emory stood near the door, shoulders hunched, watching shadows ripple across the wooden floor like ghosts looking for shelter. Inside, the women moved differently now, quickened, alert, exchanging short glances that carried full sentences. One of the younger women was breathing heavy, her hand pressed to her lower belly. She didn't cry out, only grit her teeth and braced herself against the wall. Her eyes blinked slow and dark, rainwater still clinging to her lashes. Emory took a step forward, uncertain. "She all right?" he asked into the room, though no one answered. Instead, Luda crossed the floor and gently helped the girl down into a pile of dried hay near the hearth. It wasn't much, just a blanket beneath and shawls gathered hastily. The others formed a protective half-circle, murmuring in low tones that filled the cabin like the hush of prayer. Then the groan came. Not loud, but raw, ancient. It twisted through Emory's spine and rooted him to the spot. He hadn't heard that sound since Ruth. Back then it had been hope, then silence. Ruth had clutched his hand, her face pale, her body trembling. Blood came, so much of it. He had screamed for help that never came. She had lost the baby before she even saw its face. Now, in this same room, that echo returned. This time, there was no scream, only motion. Luda knelt on the floor, sleeves rolled to her elbows, face unreadable. She worked with a calm passed down through centuries, her hands not hesitant, not fearful. The other women passed cloth, water, a carved bone knife. One burned sage in the corner. The smoke rose toward the beams, mixing with steam from the boiling kettle. Emory stumbled back toward the old cabinet, threw it open with shaking fingers. He searched beneath cans and folded cloth until he found it, Ruth's woven shawl. It was soft with time, frayed at the corners, the thread still holding her scent like a ghost refusing to leave. He hadn't touched it in years. He carried it to Luda without words and laid it beside her. She looked up once, met his eyes, then placed it beneath the girl's head like a cradle of memory. The storm outside cracked the sky open, thunder shaking the glass panes. But the women didn't flinch. They leaned in tighter, shielding the girl's body with their own. Their presence, a shelter more solid than walls. The girl arched her back once, teeth bared, and the world narrowed to her breath. Then a sound. Small, wet, fragile, crying, a baby's first cry. Cracking the air like dawn splitting the night, Luda held the child up, slick and trembling, then pressed her close to the mother's chest. The girl sobbed, without shame, without fear. The others wept too, not loudly, but in silence that trembled with something holy. One reached for the shawl and tucked it tighter around mother and child, a cocoon against the storm. Emory turned away, unable to look. His chest hurt in places. He thought had long gone numb. He braced himself against the doorframe, one hand pressed flat against the wood. The memory of Ruth's silence after her miscarriage, the days she wouldn't speak, the way she looked out the window as if searching for a name she'd never get to say, rose inside him like floodwater. But this girl had named her baby, Luta. Came to him later, after the crying had softened into breath, after the fire had eaten its way down to quiet embers. She stood beside him at the door and said, "We call her Damana, means dawn." He nodded once, voice caught behind his teeth. Outside, the storm began to wane. The rain softened, became a whisper. The land beyond the window had turned to mud and silver, steam rising from the earth, like it too had survived something. Inside, the candles still burned, each flame holding steady now, no longer dancing in fear. They glowed like sentinels, not just of light, but of forgiveness, of life returning where it had once been taken. Emory sat down slowly in the old chair beside the hearth. It creaked beneath his weight, not in protest, but in memory. The room smelled of pine, blood, smoke, and birth, a strange mixture of the sacred and the brutal. He looked at the fire, then at the girl holding the baby. The shawl wrapped around them like a promise someone had dared to make again. Sometimes, he thought, the storm outside matches the one in your chest, and sometimes if you let it, both can pass. You're willing to hold through. The baby changed everything. Not with noise, she was quiet mostly. Soft gurgle now and then, a cry that faded when cradled against a warm breast. But her presence shifted the cabin's rhythm like a stream redirected around new stone. Every action carried more weight. Every silence pressed deeper. Emory noticed it first in the way the women moved around him, less cautious now, not disrespectful, but no longer strangers. They took 2 tasks without asking. One woman began sweeping the hearth with a cedar bundle. Another repaired the window latch with his own rusted nails. In the corner, the eldest sharpened a skinning knife with long, deliberate strokes, not threatening, but firm. The sound of steel on stone filled the quiet like a heartbeat. He watched them with arms crossed and jaw set. He wasn't sure what rankled more, the fact that they made themselves useful without permission, or that he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. The food shelves thinned, not alarmingly, but enough to be noticed. Emory counted the dried corn cakes, the salted pork, the flour sack that now folded more easily than it had in months. Yet no one asked for more. The women shared in silence, portioning without greed. He caught one girl handing her piece of bread to the mother, nursing the newborn. No one told her to. It was just done. And still, Luda watched him, her gaze held. No challenge, no submission either. It was the look of someone waiting, not for judgment, but for truth. That look wore on him more than the hunger. One morning, he went to the storage chest in the back room, the one he hadn't opened in nearly. For winters, it held things Ruth had packed herself: a feather fan, a pressed flower book, a blue shawl with stitched moons along the edge. And beneath it all, folded with reverent care, her wedding dress. He had kept it not for memory, but for the strange weight it held, a reminder of vows he hadn't kept well enough. It was still there.
Oh.
But something was different. The folds were too fresh. The lace near the collar had been smoothed. Someone had touched it. His breath caught in his throat, not from fear, from something sharper. He turned and saw the birth shawl, the one Ruth had made, hanging dry by the door. Freshly cleaned, the blood gone, but the threads still worn in the same places. He hadn't asked them to wash it, but they had, not to take it, to return it. That was the thing, nothing had been taken. They had moved through his life like wind. Moves through tall grass, rearranging things without breaking them, as if they belonged here more than he ever had. He slammed the chest shut, his hands shaking. Outside, snow had melted into slush. Mud pooled near the cabin steps. And in that soft spring rot, the past came knocking. A rider approached, horse slow, and boots caked with red earth. Calder, a former cavalryman with a voice like rust and suspicion in his eyes. Emory met him on the porch before he got too close. The rifle hung in its usual place, within reach. "You heard?" Calder asked, eyes narrowing. "Town's buzzin'. See you've got visitors." Murray's hand rested on the porch post, thumb rubbing grooves Ruth once carved with a pocket knife. "I've got no one," he said. "Just me and ghosts, Calder." Didn't believe him, but he didn't push. He glanced toward the cabin, where no movement betrayed life. The women had grown clever and quiet. He nodded once, chewed the inside of his cheek, then turned his horse. "Ghosts don't eat flour," he muttered and rode off. Emory stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat, the sky a heavy gray pressing down on the prairie. He didn't know what made him angrier, that the town might come looking, or that he had lied to protect what wasn't his. Back inside, he found Luda by the hearth, kneeling. The baby slept beside her, bundled in Ruth's old flannel. Didn't rise, didn't offer apology or explanation, She only looked at him and nodded once, like a quiet understanding passed between them. He didn't say anything. He just walked to the shelf, tore a piece of jerky in half, and handed it to her. She took it without lowering her eyes. That night, he sat in the rocking chair again. Not out of habit, not out of grief, just to feel the weight of it beneath him. The cabin didn't feel like it had been invaded. It felt lived in. He watched the fire burn low. Shadows curled around the floor. The smell of herbs and smoke filled the air. A lullaby hummed softly from the corner, the melody unlike any Ruth ever sang, but soothing all the same. Emory leaned back. He hadn't surrendered anything. He'd just risked sharing space, and in doing so, had made room for someone else's pain to finally rest beside his own. The morning air was crisp, touched with the scent of thawed earth and old timber. Ice had retreated into the shade, and with it, some invisible weight seemed to lift from the cabin's roof. The land was still bruised by winter, but the wind no longer howled. It whispered. The kind of whisper that coaxed growth from cracked bark and brittle roots. Emory stood in the open barn doorway, shoulders squared, hammer in hand. The structure leaned like an old man after a long walk. Roof half-caved, hinges rusted. It had sagged that way for 2 winters, and he'd let it, just like he'd let everything else. But not today. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him. Luda stood a few paces away, her eyes narrowing at the crooked frame like it had insulted her ancestors. Emory hesitated, then held out the hammer. She took it not with ceremony, but with calm acceptance, as if he'd offered her something sacred and overdue. They worked in rhythm, slow and steady. She removed nails with her fingers, strong and calloused. He lifted broken beams and held them while she fastened them back into place. No words passed between them. None were needed. They spoke in nods, in the passing of tools, in the shared groan of tired muscles and splintered wood around them. The others moved with the same quiet intention. One woman cleared brush from the fence line. Another milked the goats that had begun to bleat louder as the days warmed. Buckets of water were hauled from the well and lined up neatly by the door. No one asked what needed doing. They just did it, the land noticed. The soil, long starved of motion and care, responded in subtle ways. Moss returned to the stones. Chickens began nesting again. A dandelion bloomed beside the firewood pile, yellow and defiant. That evening they built a fire outside, not for survival, but for something older. A circle formed naturally, each woman seated in her place. Backs to the wind, faces to the flame. The baby gurgled softly in her sling, her eyes wide and unblinking at the glow. Emory joined them, slowly, his boots stirring the ash-dusted dirt as he sat near the outer edge. The flames danced upward, licking at the stars that blinked awake above them. Luda sat beside him, her presence neither too near nor too far. Just close enough to share the warmth. She undid her braid, the one she wore like armor, and unraveled a single long strand wrapped in red thread and beads carved from river stone. Without speaking, she placed it in his palm. It was light, but it felt like something heavy had shifted between them. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. I never told her goodbye, he said quietly, the fire reflecting in. His eyes, Ruth. She died in spring. Fever took her quick. We'd sat at a fire just like this the night before. I'd made coffee too bitter, and she laughed at me for it. Said I'd never learn the right measure. That was the last sound I ever heard from her. The fire popped gently. The baby stirred but did not cry. She braided flowers into her hair sometimes, he went on. Not for show. Just because. It made her smile. I used to think that was foolish. I think maybe it was holy. Luda nodded, then looked into the flames. They did not touch hands. They didn't lean in. Something passed between them, as soft as ash on wind. Not romance, not promise. Something smaller, quieter. Recognition. He held the braid she'd given him, turning it slowly between his fingers. The thread felt warm from her skin, the stones cool like river water. The firelight flickered against their faces, both lined with years, both marked by loss. But tonight, in that ring of warmth and silence, they looked like people who had not been broken, but rebuilt. They stayed there long after the flames dipped low, long after the sky turned ink-dark and full of quiet stars. Some flames don't burn, Emory thought. Some mend, and maybe silence, the right kind, could become a kind of prayer. The sky was too still for mourning. That kind of quiet always meant something was coming, not rain, something worse. The birds had gone silent. Even the goats stood uneasily by the fence, ears twitching toward the ridge. Reese saw the dust. Before he saw the riders. 2 figures on horseback, one he knew, the other a stranger. Calder, the neighbor with a cavalryman's spine and a preacher's patience for judgment, rode in front. Beside him, a man with a tin star on his chest, and a hard squint in his eyes. Emory stepped down from the porch slow, the rifle in his hand, not raised, not pointed, just present. The women stayed inside. The baby he knew was tucked in someone's arms, heart beating fast like a rabbit in brush. "You've got people here," Calder said flatly, reining his horse too close to the step. "People who don't belong." The marshal glanced toward the cabin. "We got word, 10 of 'em, not travelers, not settlers. Comanche, you harboring." Emory didn't flinch. He looked the marshal in the eye. "I opened a door. It ain't the same," Calder snapped. "No," Emory said quietly. "It's not." The wind tugged at his coat. His grip on the rifle stayed calm, not defensive, not fearful, steady, like a man who'd already made peace with whatever would come. "I fought beside men who burned their homes," he said. "Watched them take what wasn't theirs and call it duty. I said nothing then. Thought it wasn't mine to speak." The marshal shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "My wife knew better," Emory continued. "She taught me that silence is a choice, same as a bullet. These women, they didn't take anything. They brought something back. Fire. Life. The sound of breath in this place again. I won't send them away for the comfort of men who've never had to answer to ghosts." The wind caught the edge of his words and carried them out over the land like scripture. The marshal looked toward the hills, toward the rising smoke from someone's far-off field, then back to Emory. "They're not hurting anyone?" he asked, but softer now. "No," Emory answered. "They're healing." A long pause hung between them, thick as dust. Finally, the marshal nodded once. "Keep it quiet. Don't stir. Town up more than it already is." Calder spat into the dirt, furious. "This land ain't meant for. It's not your land," Emory said. Not harsh, just true. "It's theirs more than it ever was mine." Calder said nothing else, just yanked his reins hard and turned downhill. The marshal lingered a moment longer. "You're changing, Hale. Not too late, I hope." With that, the marshal rode off, leaving silence behind. Inside, Luda stood near the doorway. She hadn't asked him to fight.
Yes.
She hadn't asked him for anything. But now, her gaze held something different. Waiting, not guarded. Trust. That night, Emory hitched the wagon, said nothing, just loaded supplies and looked to the road north, toward safer places, friendlier borders. "Wagon's yours," he told them, "if you want it." Some nodded, packed quietly, hugging one another. 3 women and the younger girl with the child climbed up. Luta helped tie down the bundles. Her hands moved steady. Her eyes never left his. "You going?" he asked. She looked toward the cabin, then at the earth beneath her feet. "No," she said simply. "This land knows my name now." He didn't argue. He only nodded. Once, slow. He walked beside the wagon as it pulled away, boots crunching through thawed soil, one hand resting on the edge. When it disappeared. Over the hill, he stood there a while, listening to the wheel creak fade into distance. When he turned back, Luta was still there. The others, too. Already moving, gathering wood, patching the water trough, tying back the door that always swung wrong in the wind. Spring arrived in slow breaths. Tiny green shoots between stones.
Out.
The creek near the ridge started to hum again. The porch, where snow once sat in drifts. The first purple flowers bloomed beside the wax drippings of old candles. Emory built a second chair. He placed it beside Ruth's, just far enough that the firelight could reach both. And on the hook, where no coat had hung for years, he left a braid, red-threaded. River stone wrapped, waiting for the wind to speak. Justice didn't come loud, didn't come quick. It came in the way he rose before dawn, how he fetched water for others, how he listened now when others sang. It came in how he chose to live, differently than the men who had raised him.